Welcome to this lecture, guys. Until now, we've really been focusing a lot more on the sacred side of music from the early Renaissance. And now I'm going to turn our attention to the secular music of the Renaissance. What we'll be doing in this lecture is exploring the different kinds of secular music, particularly from different regions. Today, of course, these are countries, but we'll be looking at music from Germany, Spain, France, Italy, as well as England. These are all different secular national styles, and they often have a lot in common. The graphics I have up here for you guys, this one on the top left is actually a German Lied or tenor Lied. This is the main melody line that you're looking at. This is how it would have been printed. The next one on the top right is actually from Italy. And this, as you'll find out, is called a frottola. The strange little symbols on the bottom staff are actually tablature, and we'll talk about that as well. And then on the lower right, we've got a lute song, which is actually in modern notation, but on the bottom you can see again we have tablature. If any of you guys are familiar with guitar tab, this is the same thing. It's a pictogram for where to place your hands on the instrument, but I'll go into more detail on that later. And guys, the last graphic on the bottom right is actually of a printing press, which is of the probably most significance of almost any other invention in this time period. The way that it would work is that the music would go through 3 times if it was Mr. Petrucci that was printing it, which is called triple impression printing, and it's very beautiful. Or, as you'll find out, some other printers did what's called single impression printing, which means it only went through the press once and didn't look as good, but could get out to the public faster. So, a few things for you to think about as we start this lecture. We'll be beginning with Germany. So, ladies and gentlemen, beginning with Germany. You might remember speaking about the troubadours in the medieval period with me and learning about them. In Germany, they have their own brand of secular monophony, which is actually very similar to what the troubadours were writing. However, this was developed by folks who were called the Minnesingers. Minne means love, and zingers means singer. The Minnesingers were actually nobles, much like the troubadours, and instead of their love songs focusing on a mortal woman, they tended to write love songs which focused on the Virgin Mary. But they were very much a noble class and tradition. Then, after the Minnesingers began their tradition of songwriting in Germany, that tradition was taken over by a group called the Meistersingers. And that is a word you may have heard in connection with Wagner's opera Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg. What that means is master singer. And this is a very different tradition than the Minnesingers. These were gentlemen who lived in the city and tended to be of the rising middle class in the Renaissance. They were usually called a guild of the Meistersingers, and they would have meetings and invent songs according to certain poetic or musical forms. So this is not a courtly tradition, but an urban tradition. And guild members tended to not be professional musicians, but usually had a trade, such as being an artisan, a cobbler, a butcher. One of the forms that they are credited with inventing is called bar form. And that's very simple, guys. It's simply A, which is your refrain, and then sometimes that is repeated with the same music but different words, and then B, which is your verse. The A was called the Stollen, or the refrain, and the B was called the Abgesang, which means the verse. Then the next step in German song after the Guild of the Meistersingers was what we call the Lied, or the tenor Lied. Lied simply means song in German, and Tenorlied means tenor song. So our sources for this are the Glogauer Liederbuch, which was probably sometime in 1480 compiled, and that contains mostly Lied. The difference between Lied and Tenorlied is that in Lied, the tune or the melody is in the top voice or the soprano voice. In Tenorlied, the tune is in the tenor voice. So the other source, guys, is the Lochamer Liederbuch, compiled, we think, in 1455 to 1460. And that contains mostly tenor Lied. Of course, you'll notice that one's a little bit earlier. So tenor Lied tends to be more popular earlier in the Renaissance, and then the trend switches to having the tune in the top voice, and it is called Lied. In terms of features that you would see in a Lied or a tenor Lied, we have a combination of both German features and also features that are popular in the Burgundian court. What you tend to see is a strophic setting, and we remember that that means the same music but with different words. We also have simple poetry, which is normally about love, nature, or the homeland, as you'll see in our example. Usually the phrases are very simple and very melodious, and often also sound like they may have been taken from popular tunes. There is generally an avoidance of dissonance in this music or very complex settings. Usually the composers favor syllabic or largely consonant settings. Any polyphonic or contrapuntal technique is based upon the influence of the Franco-Flemish composers of the Burgundian court. An example that you guys can take a look at in your anthologies, page 204, is Heinrich Isaac's Innsbruck, ich muss dich lassen. You'll notice as you look at this that each line is set to its own music with some rests in between. So each phrase is very clearly delineated, and those rests mark the ending of that phrase. In this case, what we're looking at is a lead because the tune is in the top voice. This would have been performed strophically, so what they've done in the recording is to sing us the first verse, and then they would sing subsequent verses to the same music. I would say, guys, in terms of theory and counterpoint, this piece is modal, still in modal harmony rather than actual tonal harmony that we associate with music today. Also, this may appear familiar to some of you because later the melody was adapted to the words O Welt, ich muss dich lassen, or O world, I must now leave thee. Martin Luther took the tune and put different words to it, which we know is called contrafactum technique. Another very well-known composer of the lead, along with Mr. Isaac, was Ludwig Zenfel. And in fact, the graphic I'm showing here to you, ladies and gentlemen, is in fact of Mr. Zenfel. This is a piece that he wrote, which was printed later. Zenfel worked at the Bavarian court in Munich, and much as Isaac, he was thought of as a very fine composer, but I think Isaac was seen at the time as someone who was even more powerful and had more influence. Zenfel and Isaac both were really, really interested in double meanings and messages in their pieces. So it's kind of like the Bach motives that you often see, the BACH, where Bach signs his name. So with these pieces, oftentimes the intervals, the space between notes, would sometimes have a special meaning to people who were aware of the songwriting rules from the Meistersinger Guild. Sometimes these intervals were meant to mirror alchemy or magic or astronomy, and generally they were only recognized by other members of the guild. So it was a very special genre, and while it may sound simple, there's often a lot more going on underneath the surface than you might expect. From here we move on to Spain, ladies and gentlemen, and to the villancico, which simply means song to those who speak Spanish. And one could not possibly discuss the villancico without discussing the primary accompanimental instrument for this genre, which is called the vihuela. The vihuela is Spanish for the word viola, because we originally think that the vihuela was actually a bowed instrument that came into Spain, probably by way of Morocco. The vihuela was incredibly popular for its versatility as a solo or as an accompanimental instrument. It can sort of be considered the Renaissance equivalent to the piano. One of the major treatises that was written on how to play the vihuela has a very long name, which is sort of fun to say. It is Libro de Música e Vihuela de Mano Endulado el Maestro, which means music for the vihuela of the hand, or the viola of the hand, entitled El Maestro, the Master. But usually it's simply referred to by scholars as the Master or El Maestro, printed in Valencia in 1536. And this is a really useful treatise for us because it tells us a lot about one of the first instruments in the Renaissance that becomes quite popular. So it tells us how one should finger the instrument, the different sizes of instruments which were used, because it wasn't just tenor, it was also treble and bass. Also explained the use of tablature, as well as it contained several first-rate pieces for the instrument itself. The graphic I have up here, guys, for you is actually the title page of El Maestro, and the person who is playing it is supposed to be Apollo, who was one of the gods of music in ancient Greek mythology. And he is in fact holding what was supposed to be a vihuela. So that gives you an idea of what it may have looked like. As a reminder, the gentleman that wrote that treatise is named Luis da Milano, or Luis Milan. We believe he was around from about 1500 to 1561. Milan also composed in the genre of the villancico along with another Spanish composer whose name was Juan del Encina or Juan del Encina. Because he was in the Catalonian region of Spain, we're not quite sure how to say his name because at this point in history the king lisped, which is why Catalonians also lisp in their Spanish, because if the king lisps, the rest of you also have to lisp. Anyway, Juan del Encina, or Encina, was very likely alive from 1469 to 1529, and he was well known for his contributions to the villancico as a genre. The villancico has some similarities to the German Lied, or tenor Lied. The complexity that was largely avoided in the Lied definitely comes very late to Spain, not until about the 15th century, in fact. So the Spanish national style involved the following: generally homophonic, strophic songs with a refrain that would be sung at the beginning and the end. The subject matter usually had to do with love or celebration of some sort. The song form in this case is large A, large B, small a, and then large A. So you can see you have a refrain, which is large A at the very beginning and the very end, and then a few things in the middle that are a little bit different. Melody, unlike in the tenor Lied, is always in the top voice, and melodies tend to be very folk-like and very pop sounding. Popular music was quite an influence in Spain. In terms of how this would have been printed, ladies and gentlemen, often it would be printed in what is called choir book format. And what that means is that you have 4 books with various pieces in them, one for soprano, one for alto, one for tenor, and one for bass. And that is very similar, in fact, to our modern orchestral score parts. Oftentimes, because of a lack of other singers, the top part would be sung, and the rest of the parts would simply be looked at and reduced down to an accompaniment by a vihuela player. So a typical setup for singing the villancico would be 1 singer and 1 player, or 4 singers. More unusual would probably be 4 singers and 1 vihuela, because then you're just doing a lot of doubling. Another important feature of the vihuela accompaniment in a villancico is that there was generally a lot of ornamentation, and the reason for that is because the vihuela is an instrument which has a lot of decay. It's a plucked instrument. So in order to keep a chord going, you more or less have to keep striking the same chord. So that leads to a lot of ornaments. So the accompaniment for a villancico, when a vihuela is accompanying, it's often very virtuosic and oftentimes very difficult to play as well. The accompaniment is meant to support the form of the text, and both the vihuela and the voice, I would say, are equally important, very much like 19th century Lieder in Germany. Collections of villancicos were collected in books which were called canzoneros, which means songbook. One of the great examples in your anthology on page 287 is Juan del Encina's Hoy comamos y bebamos, which means let us eat and let us drink and let us party, for tomorrow we all diet. This villancico was specifically written to be performed before Lent, which was a time of fasting. So this was a huge party that they often had right beforehand, which is called Carnival. Many people would dress up in costumes and portray certain characters and just have a grand old time before everybody had to stop all the partying and fast. This piece is written for many voices as opposed to the traditional one voice, because in the text it actually says, let us drink, let us eat, let us do this, let's stuff ourselves. So it may have actually been performed in that more unusual setup of 4 singers and a vihuela. The texture is homophonic with very simple harmonies. We have a lot of root position triads, which makes it sound very folkish. We also have a lot of dance-like rhythms that use hemiolas to shift between 6/8 and 3/4. So enjoy listening to this one, guys. This is a really fun incarnation of this piece. Guys, on this slide, I have for you an actual representation from the time period of a vihuela and what one looked like up there on the right-hand corner. And then I also wanted to address the topic of instrumental music, since we were just talking about an instrument that was widely used in the Renaissance period. The vihuela was not only a very valuable accompanimental instrument, but was also known for being one of the first instruments for which solo music was being written. And I'm sure you guys have some associations with the following words, such as toccata, prelude, and fantasia. And I want you to know sort of where they come from and what they were originally meant and used for. So a toccata simply means to touch. And that is a piece that might have been played by a vihuela player simply to set a key and be sure that the instrument is in tune. So oftentimes it would have a lot of contrasting sections, some flashy virtuosity, and then some pretty straight ahead homophony. So this is something a player would often play before he was really ready to start his show, just to make sure everything was working right on the instrument and that it was in tune. A prelude, which simply means before, is also improvisatory in nature. The purpose of that piece is to set up a piece which is to follow, and generally to establish a key and also establish the fact that the instrument is in tune. So again, the toccata and the prelude often had a lot of the same functions, but the prelude usually does come before a second piece. The fantasia or fantasy is something that's also entirely improvised on the spot. You may be noticing that that's a theme with a lot of this music. Improvisation was truly an art form which was expected of performers at this time. So in a fantasia, you had a lot of different tempos in each section. So a real contrast of virtuosic and contrapuntal passages. And for this, the purpose isn't so much about trying to tune the instrument as it is to transport the listener on a musical journey. So it's a little more of an advanced and complex piece. So, ladies and gentlemen, we now move from Spain to the country today of France and the genre of the Parisian chanson. The couple of graphics that I have up here for you, one of them probably looks familiar because it's the printing press that you saw earlier in the lecture on the first slide. The other is an example of the choir book format that I was telling you guys about in the villancico. This is the superius, or the soprano part, for a particular chanson, and that would be what the sopranos saw. As you can see, there are no bar lines, and the notation looks kind of similar to our modern notation, but has some differences. So the deal with this particular genre, the Parisian chanson was the genre of choice between the years 1515 and 1547. This is specifically during the reign of King Francis I. This is probably a genre that I would say peaks in 1528. That's when the most publications are being put out. Something to be clear about, guys. Chanson, the word chanson by itself simply means a secular vocal piece with a French text, or a song. However, the word Parisian chanson is very specific to the Renaissance, the French secular song during the first part of the 16th century. I have on this slide the name Pierre Attignon, and this gentleman was a very popular French publisher who really brought the Parisian chanson to its prominence. He printed more than 50 collections of chansons, specifically Parisian chanson, between the years 1530 and 1550. His printing method is simple and less elegant than Petrucci's, and I also mentioned that Petrucci used triple impression printing, whereas Attignon used single impression. So it may not look quite as pretty on the page, but again, you can get it out to the public much more quickly, and it's also easier to distribute. The performance practice of a Parisian chanson, you would definitely see people performing this during the time period 1-2 apart. If there was any accompaniment, it would probably be on the lute. Each voice in a score is independently texted, and that is not true of a lot of the other genres that we've looked at. But in France, they're very particular about their words, so they want to have all of the texts underneath those notes. It would also be printed in choir book format, so again in part books. And as far as musical characteristics go, these pieces were usually very musically simple and also possible to perform if one is an amateur. And again, that word has some pretty nasty connotations in our time period. All that means is someone who doesn't perform music for a living. So Attignon was quite successful for the sale of his music because, again, the middle class of the Renaissance really wants to imitate the upper class who are all musically trained. So many of them are now going out and buying all of these part books and then singing the songs around the table after dinner. One of the popular poets of this genre was a gentleman by the name of Clement Marot. His poetic elements were great because they spoke to both aristocratic circles and also contained some more down-to-earth elements as well. It was high-quality poetry but less complex than the courtly love poetry of the Burgundian chanson, which was sort of considered the high art music. This was more for fun. The Parisian chanson fell into three different categories. The love song, which tended to have sort of earthy poetry. These settings are often strophic and homophonic and may have contained some passages with fast text setting, or they could be entirely syllabic. This song usually contained some literary imagery taken from the Burgundian chanson, but it was still considered more romantic. Then there was the body song, which was often very cynical in nature when it dealt with the subject of love, and there was usually clever wordplay on body parts. So, very naughty things that they would say. This was usually strophic with a certain amount of simple counterpoint. And then the program song was the most popular type of Parisian chanson, which was meant to produce a soundscape of some sort of topic. And examples would be, say, a marketplace, or a battlefield, or a forest. These, however, were usually through compose, not strophic. They didn't always follow the form of the text, and sound effects were especially important. The most popular sound effects were bird calls, gunshots, and nonsense syllables. So when I was an undergrad, I always remembered this by saying tweet, tweet, bang, bang, fa la 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 la. So this type of song set the important precedent of imitating nature and is then picked up later on in the 19th century by Romantic composers who want to write program music. A great example is Jeannequin's La Guerre, and I encourage you to look that up on YouTube. The King Singers have a great version of that. So the example I'd like you guys to take a look at is in your nom text on page 322. This is Claudin de Sermecy's Tant que vivrai. This is a Parisian love song, and I'll discuss a little bit more about it in the next slide. So on to discuss Sermecy's piece, Tant que vivrai. As you guys can see, I have a nice little chart here. You know, I like charts by now, about the texture, form, and the rhyme scheme. And as you can see, guys, this is mostly homophonic, which again means everyone's moving in the same rhythms, more or less. And the melody is in the top voice, so we would consider that treble dominated, very typical of this genre. Inner voices are mostly there to fill in the harmony, and we believe that the accompaniment that's on the recording is probably a lute. You'll also notice, guys, when you listen to the entire recording, how they vary things. And again, ornamentation was part of this. Ornamentation does not only mean adding extra notes, but also varying articulations, dynamics, phrasing, and other such things. So when you listen to it, pay attention to those. The form is modified strophic, I would say, because it's the same music over and over again, but it's not just four notes over and over again. So we would call this A, and then small a, and then large B, because we hear the first section twice each time, but with different words the second time. And then the B section is very different. As you can see, the rhythmic values are twice as fast when we move from the A section to the B section. The rhyme scheme of this piece, you can see right here. If you look at the endings of the words, it's very clear that it's AAB, AAB, and then C, C, D, D, E, E, and then another D, just for fun. So again, very simple rhyme scheme. You guys might also notice as you look at the text that this is not quite the very sublimated version of love that courtly love would be. This poet is actually talking about the fair lady with the lovely body, which is something that's very much more earthy that you would probably not hear in the more sublimated courtly love of the troubadours. However, there are a lot of references to the King of Love, and anytime you mention king in French music, that also is referring to the actual king. Many of Francis I's exploits were heralded in Parisian chanson. In fact, Jeannequin's La Guerre is a description of the Battle of Marignan, which Francis I won against the Swiss for the city-state of Milan in the year 1515. And guys, here we are on our whirlwind tour of Europe, now in Italy, and talking about the genre of the frottola. I wanted to tell you about these two graphics that I have on this slide here. The one at the very top of the page is an actual frottole in its original notation. And I said I would explain the whole idea of tabulature to you guys. What you see on the bottom, although it looks like a staff, is actually a pictorial representation of the strings of a lute and where one would put one's fingers. The rhythmic values that you see over top of the staff would be repeated until you see a different one. This is the Italian version of tabulature. There were three different versions: Italian, French, and German. The French version, rather than using numbers, used letters, and the German version, of course being German and complex, uses both numbers and letters. The lovely lady in the picture right below this tabulature is Isabella d'Este, and she is the one responsible for cultivating this genre. Yes, a woman. By the way, the frottole pictured above her is by Marco Cara, and you'll find out who he is in just a moment. So Italy is home to the frottole, and frottole is more or less an umbrella term for an Italian repertory of secular songs that were popular between 1480 and 1520. The first frottole that we know of were published by our good friend Ottavio Petrucci. We know that he was publishing the frottole in his first years of publishing in Venice. Between the years 1504 and 1514, Petrucci published 11 collections of frottole, and these were also put out in choir book format. Two Italian courts assisted with the development of this genre: the court of Mantua, which was ruled by the Gonzaga family, and the court of Ferrara, which was ruled by the Este family. Incidentally, the city of Ferrara is where the car, the Ferrari, is from. Bet you didn't know that. Both are highly sophisticated courts, and in both of these courts, very great humanist work was performed. These courts both supported the best humanist schools as well as the best architecture, visual arts, and music. Political ties between these two families included many marriages, but one specific marriage between a Mantua son and a Ferrara lady. And the Ferrara lady, as you may have guessed by now, is Isabella d'Este. Isabella d'Este was a very highly educated lady, as were many women of the upper class, and she was also quite knowledgeable about music. She was known as a very fine singer and lute player herself, especially in musical circles. When she agreed to marry Fernando Gonzaga, she went to Mantua with her court and continued to be a great lover of music there. However, because she is a lady, there are certain restrictions. She is not allowed to patronize or run the chapel choir, or offer positions of employment to important composers and other musicians of the time. That is all the realm of her husband. So therefore, Isabella decided to cultivate her own genre, the repertory of the frottole. This was considered to be a more fun repertory than the Burgundian chanson, which was considered to be the high art music at court. What is interesting, guys, is that the frottole in many ways is almost seen as a reaction against the Burgundian chanson, because whatever exists in the frottole does not exist in the Burgundian chanson, and vice versa. I'll explain more about that in a moment. So the frottole does have a wide variety of styles, more so than many of the other secular national styles we've looked at. So it can be simple homophonic setting, or it could also be a very elaborate contrapuntal setting. Generally, the simple musical settings had more complex texts, and the reverse was also true, so that you never have too much of one thing. Otherwise, it's going to be too much like the Burgundian chanson, which is complex and has very complicated text. However, that's not to say that the frottole did not enjoy good text. And some of the texts that were set were Horatian odes that were connected to humanism. Also set were Petrarchan sonnets, very much in accord with the older styles and poetry of the troubadours, such as the Ottavio, the sonnet, and epic poetry in octava rima, where every 8 lines must rhyme. One of the best frottole composers of the time was Marchetto, or Marco Cara de Padua. His dates are 1470 to 1525, and we know that he worked at the court of Mantua for the Gonzaga family for almost 30 years, employed there as a singer and a lutenist, and he probably was Isabella d'Este's private teacher for the lute and voice as well. His music was so highly regarded that often poets would send him their verse to set. And an example of that is Ariosto, who was a very well-known Renaissance poet, wrote the epic poem Orlando Furioso about Roland the Crusading Knight. And specifically, in his poem, he mentions the knights at the courts of Charlemagne. He also mentions various nobles at the court of Mantua, including the famous singing of the Duchess Isabella d'Este. So this is a very wise thing to do if you're trying to get your verse set to music, which will then be heard by nobles. On the next slide, ladies and gentlemen, I will have a lovely new chart to identify the differences between the Burgundian chanson and the frottola. So just follow along on the next slide. Here are some of the differences between the Burgundian chanson and the frottola, ladies and gentlemen. You can see if you look at this chart why they might have been seen as a reaction to one another if we take a look at things like text, form, and melody. The Burgundian chanson is always based on courtly love when it comes to text, or 99.9% of the time. That text tends to be very complex and have very sophisticated allegory and imagery. Whereas if you look at the text of the frottola, it tends to deal with earthy, physical love, which is something you'd never speak about in courtly love, and tends to use simpler verse and also simpler imagery, so it's very accessible. The form of the Burgundian chanson is varied, but three basic sets, and again, this comes down to us from the troubadours: the rondeau, A-B-A-A, A-B-A-B, the ballade, A-A-B, and the virelai, A-B-B-A. The frottola is usually strophic, so again uses the same music with different verses of text. It can, however, sometimes use what's called barzelletta form, and that is AABA. So it's kind of similar to a ballade in its form. The melody of the Burgundian chanson is usually quite complex and difficult to sing, really intended for professionals, and is almost always newly composed for this high art music. Whereas the frottola's melody is usually very vocal, very stepwise, generally more accessible, could be sung by amateurs, and tends to imitate pre-existing popular music. So these are some important differences to be aware of. Very different genres cultivated by very different parts of the court. And as you can see, it would be okay for a woman to cultivate the frottola because it's not seen as a very, very serious genre in this very male-dominated culture. Now, ladies and gentlemen, for an actual example of the frottola, if you could turn in your anthologies to page 290. This is one of our friend Marco Cara de Padua's frottola, Io non compro più speranza. This is an interesting case because actually this piece was written originally in 4 parts in choir book format, much like our other examples of secular national style, but this version has actually been reduced down to accompaniment with voice and lute. So that is for your benefit and how this might have been performed. The form is modified strophic because we do repeat a lot of music, but there actually is an internal form to the music. And you'll notice it's a bit familiar, A-A-B-A. We've seen this in several other pieces of secular national style. The Italians call this barzelletta form. The accompaniment for this, again, functions as harmonica support. First part of the musical line asks a question and the second part answers it, much like in classical music where you have an antecedent and a consequent. Io non compro più speranza. That would be the question, and then che di falsa mercancia would be the answer. Also, we have this nice telltale ending in 2 half notes. It's very typical to see in this genre. It sort of tells us it's a frottola. Io non compro più speranza che di falsa mercancia. So that's another thing that you'll see a lot in this genre. Imagery in this is actually very interesting. A man who has finally given up hope, as I say in this chart, that his lady will love him, because he's saying he will buy no more hope. That is why we think the frottola is a reaction against the Burgundian chanson, because the Burgundian chanson is always talking about courtly love, and I will always love this lady and always hope that she will love me back. Hope, 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 hope. But in this case, this guy is saying, I'm done hoping. It's over. Unless you want to be with me, then in that case, okay, but I am not going to hope for you to be with me anymore. And in fact, while this is also obviously a metaphor for buying and selling and trade in Venice, this would not have been out of place at court. Many people ask me that question because it seems like nobles would sort of not want to have anything to do with the merchant trade. But in fact, they enjoyed playing at being middle class people and in that business of trade the same way that the middle class people enjoyed pretending that they were nobles. So that's a bit of information about this piece. So, ladies and gentlemen, here we are in our last stop. We are now in England with the Lute Song. And the few graphics I have up here for you are of the compositions of the primary composer we'll be taking a look at for the Lute Song. The one on the bottom right is one of his lute pieces. This is John Dowland, incidentally. And the one on the top is a fugue that he wrote and then signed at the bottom. And I thought you might just like to see his signature. During the Elizabethan era is when the lute song comes to prominence. It's a bit later than some of the other genres that we've looked at. This is during 1558 to 1603. It was called a lute song because it was a song that was accompanied by lute. And also, there was a similar genre called the consort song, which is a song that's accompanied by an ensemble of instruments, which the English called a consort. These were both very popular with the merchant middle class, and lute songs in particular were published in large books that have a four-voiced version on one page, and the scores are even set up so that you can sit around a table and read it, and then solo voice and lute tablature on the other. This allows for a lot of different combinations of singers, instruments, and various other combinations. Also, this makes it easy to perform by amateur singers and players alike, as well as more professional singers and players. Incidentally, guys, a consort is a group of like instruments, such as everything from the violin family, or everything from the viola da gamba family. A broken consort is when you have a group of unlike instruments, for example, a recorder and a flute and a viola da gamba and a violin, so something like that. So that is the information for lute and consort song. Moving on to John Dowland, or John Doland, as he would have been called in that time. He is probably one of our most well-known and truly amazing lute song composers. He wrote both solo lute music and also consort music. Dowland was a very interesting guy, ladies and gentlemen, for a lot of reasons. He was someone who suffered very much from what they called in this time melancholy and what today we would call depression. In fact, in this time period, it's interesting, they actually felt that melancholy was something that was helpful to artists because it was during a period of melancholy when the greatest ideas and artistic creations could be brought about. But Dowland obviously suffered with this his entire life. His whole life ambition was to become one of the Queen's lutenists, and he didn't achieve it until the last 7 or 8 years of his life, and for most of his life he was very unhappy with his current situation, wherever that was. He was lutenist to Christian IV, King of Denmark, from 1598 to 1607. And in fact, we're not quite sure, but he was apparently in correspondence based on some letters we have with the English court at this time. So it could have been that he was doing some undercover sort of spy work for them. I don't know, maybe his lute magically turned into a motorboat or something. At any rate, Dowland was lutenist in Denmark from 1598 to 1607. Unfortunately, he managed his finances very poorly. Christian IV really liked Dowland and even gave him a couple of students to train just to make a little extra money, but he still left penniless in 1607. Going along with this whole idea of him being very melancholy, every musician in this time period had sort of a personal motto, and his was Semper Dowland, semper dolens, which means always Dowland, always doleful. Despite his depression, Dowland was rather successful. His first book of lute and consort songs were strophic homophonic settings, and then you see through his life he progresses and becomes much more chromatic and less predictable, both in harmonies and in where beats are supposed to fall. It's very hard to tell where bar lines are in his music. A good example of that is one of his songs called In Darkness Let Me Dwell. Another very popular lute song composer at this time, who was actually a bit more accessible, especially to the amateur musicians, was Thomas Campion, 1567 through 1620. And in comparison to Dowland's lute songs, Campion's are much simpler and less sophisticated. And because of this, his music also sold more easily, because it was easier to play, whereas Dowland was a real lute virtuoso, and his music is much more challenging for lutenists. In Campion's songs, the text tends to outweigh the music compared to Dowland's, where I would say perhaps it's more equal. In Campion's music, again, it's probably easy enough to have the same person sing and play, whereas with Dowland, it's required that you be a much more virtuosic musician. His beautiful work on page 339 of your NOM texts, which is called Flow My Tears, is remarkable for its subtlety and attention to text setting. You'll also notice that the lute accompaniment is very carefully subordinated to the voice so that it never intrudes on what's going on with the text. This particular piece is a pavan, which is in the form AABBCC. So a lot of his other songs were strophic, but this one has an actual form to it. And this is also a dance, a slow dance in two. This was printed in the second book of Airs in 1600, and this setting was so popular that Dowland created 7 more settings, which he wrote specifically for viol consort that are based around this tune, and he called them 7 tiers. So to summarize our lecture on secular national styles, everyone, I just want to make a few final points. Generally, what we see when we look at secular national styles in terms of a form are strophic or modified strophic forms and accompaniment by a plucked instrument such as a lute or a vihuela. The choir book printing format of part books was most popular, except in England where we know they had a different layout, which was also equally accessible. The subject matter is often simple and practical, written in similarly uncomplicated verse. And all of these styles were easy to perform in a variety of ensembles by both amateurs as well as professionals.